Good morning, everyone. I'm Will Hurst, Managing Editor at the Architects Journal, and I'd like to welcome you to this AJ100 Club breakfast event. My guest this morning is David Smith-Milne, founder of Place Capital Group, a new values-driven real estate developer headquartered in Manchester, which aims to regenerate a number of former council estates around the country. Place Capital Group works with major local authorities and housing associations, delivering place-led development and regeneration and new affordable homes through both remodelling and new development. David will discuss how former council estate places are often overlooked as possible solutions to the country's affordable housing challenges, and how they can be rejuvenated to make them desirable places to live and to meet net zero goals. Now, just before I hand over to David, I'd like to extend our thanks to the AJ100 sponsors, whose valued ongoing support make these events possible. So thank you very much to our headline partners, Rocker, and thanks also to our programme sponsors, Schluter Systems and Siemens Home Appliances. So without further ado, a very warm welcome to our speaker from Place Capital Group, David Smith-Milne.
Thank you, Will, and hello everybody. Nice to meet you all. I won't spend too long giving an introduction to myself because I'd like to do that in the course of the actual presentation, if that's okay. But if you just give me one moment, I shall get my slides up ready for everybody. Are we good, Will? Can we see that? Yep, thanks. I've always thought it's a real oddity, actually, that some of the best designed housing infrastructure in the UK is actually now amongst the least popular housing in the UK. And I find that a really quite strange phenomenon. There are actually a whole load of causal explanations behind that. But if you think back to the way in which most housing estates were conceived and constructed, they were built by architects who had a very strong utopian vision at the core of their plan. And they were responding to a whole number of sort of major issues. Initially, we were housing heroes who were coming back from making great sacrifice in the war. We were also providing sort of better, healthier environments for people who'd been living in densely populated, squalid urban conditions where there was no end of social and health problem. And so the design brief that led to the creation of many of our current social housing estates included things like wide open streets to provide a sense of openness and fresh air, things like high variation in the house types, both to provide a kind of rhythm to the vernacular, but also to ensure that the properties were capable of housing people from different age groups and people from with different household composition types and so on. Most social housing estates had at the centre of them some good play infrastructure for children, and many had lots of community infrastructure, schools, community buildings and so on, as well as retail, all of which was highly walkable. And the thing that I like, about them is most of them actually had hedgerows, and those hedgerows provided boundaries which were green, but also an environment for enhanced biodiversity. Now, if you ask any sort of professional urban designer today, what are the hallmarks of a good modern place, a good modern housing environment? Many of the things that I've just listed would be on that list. So it's a perversity, really, that over time, our social housing estates have become decreasingly popular, and actually many have become quite stigmatized. And it's even more perverse, actually, that those families with an element of social mobility, particularly those seeking new build homes, are actually living environments which actually have very few of the characteristics that I've just described. So just imagine for one moment sort of standing in that environment, which is a social housing estate that was constructed in the 1950s, which has got all those features and characteristics that I've just described. And imagine the sense of place being there compared to being in its sort of modern day outright sale equivalent. The two things are unilaterally different. And I know you're probably thinking, well, that's a very nostalgic view, David. That image was taken when those properties were constructed in the 50s. Actually, this image was taken just a couple of weeks ago, which is the same estate. And actually all of the sort of architectural DNA that I've described, it remains very much there. And actually, you know, it's got a lot of good open space. It's got the DNA of a garden village, generous garden spaces, and a whole load of community infrastructure and amenity. But actually, if you strip that stuff away and have a look at what it is like today, it has a whole host of problems. Some of them, or most of them, are actually individually quite trivial. But when you collectively experience those problems, they're not trivial at all, and they have quite a profound effect upon your sense of space and your sense of place in this environment. And actually, what Place Capital as a business is doing is going to these places and trying to discover or rediscover their potential. They have become quite forgotten assets in the context of delivering the country's affordable housing output. And they've become that way because I think they've generally been ignored as having any potential by the organisations that manage them, who typically registered providers or large-scale local authorities. And our business sees an opportunity actually in lifting these areas to both benefit their current residents, but also to introduce new development to produce new housing output, which has the additional benefit of delivering more affordable homes, but also if those homes are delivered across a range of other tenures, can start to slowly shift and rebalance the socioeconomic diversity of these places. And alongside all of that, we're creating better management infrastructure and better management regimes so that the standard of development we can create and the enhanced environment we've led to the creation of can be better managed long term. But I think before we can do that, you know, we have to understand how these places became unpopular and how they led to, you know, what led to the concomitant decline in the physical environment that very many of them now experience. There was an Act of Parliament in 1977, which was actually a Labour policy, which for the first time created a unilateral change in the way society in the UK dealt with and treated social housing, actually. Until 1977, social housing was seen as a tenure of choice for everybody. But in 1977, we recognised that it was a scarce resource and needed, therefore, to be allocated on the principles of scarcity. And at that point, the government introduced a needs-based allocation system to our social housing output. And as a result, if you want to access social housing, you have to demonstrate some form of need, okay? And that's obviously very important and societally critical. But actually, over time, as the occupation of these neighbourhoods have evolved and churned, we've introduced people who are escaping things that are difficult, who are at the edge of the sort of society economically, who maybe have health problems, who maybe have challenges in accessing mainstream work. And as a consequence, we've created a social residualisation in many of our housing estates, which has led to a concentration of things like poor health and poverty. And clearly, we all know that successful and sustainable places clearly need to house people in need, but it's far better that we house those people in environments where there is diversity and greater social capital. So that's the first principal challenge, you know, that's led to the deterioration in some of our housing estates and a flight actually away from them of the more socially mobile and economically active. The second actually is partly because of this and partly because of the fact that many sort of local authorities and governments of various persuasions over the years have recognised this concentration of poverty. We've tried to introduce quite formulaic approaches to their regeneration, and they've very rarely worked. This is an example of a community hub in one of the estates that we're working on. And, you know, behind this hub is a wonderful open park, actually. And if anybody knows central Manchester, this park, which is in the middle of a housing estate, is the same size as Piccadilly Gardens, which is a major park in a major urban centre. But actually, these buildings have no reference to that park. They turn their back on them. The back of the buildings are a service yard. In the interest of community regeneration, we've managed to bring in a retailer who's a hyper-processed frozen food shop which is probably the last thing that should be retailed in this kind of environment. Next to that is a fish and chip shop, and next to that is a fags and booze shop. And the community infrastructure sits above that building behind a sort of gated entry point. So any opportunity really to sort of create an asset which is genuinely the communities has been done quite poorly. And actually the reality of why that happened is that building was built not to the community specification, but actually to the contractor's specification. He wanted to do it as profitably as it possibly could. And the organisation that commissioned it, which is the registered provider, it's done it in the best of intention. But sadly, it's not the most sort of design literate organisation. As a consequence, it's ended up with something which is not quite an asset. It's a resource for the local community, but it's materially underperforming its role. This is an image that also amuses me, which is, this is the back of that area. Now you can imagine 10 years ago when these things were created, there was a consultation exercise which said, you know, what do the community need here? And probably the community turned around and said, well, there's not enough for kids to do. So we put in place some play infrastructure. But actually, I don't know if any of you have got children or any of you are brave enough to go skateboarding. The level of professional capability you need to actually use and utilise that infrastructure is quite profound, actually. So I imagine most children who live in this estate, they look at that thing thinking, crikey, I'm going to break my neck to try and use that. And so it's no wonder, actually, it becomes a place in which antisocial behaviour tends to cluster, as opposed to where the next budding Tony Hawk's has been spawned, you know, because actually it's really difficult to use that play infrastructure. Nobody's really thought it through. They probably thought, yeah, we've got some hoodies who live here, they all like to go skateboarding. But the reality is that kind of infrastructure is better placed in a professionally managed environment where you can get some support and guidance on how to do it. Don't just drop it in the middle of a public park and expect everybody to use it. And sadly, whilst on this estate, there are lots of properties, there's 850 houses on this estate. Most people do take pride in their neighbourhood, but actually on every single street, there's a house like this. And that house, the occupiers have clearly said, well, actually, we're not really longer that bothered about maintaining our house. And as I said to you before, really, at the core of our thinking of this is reference back to a Jane Jacobs quote, which says, your trust and faith in a place is made up of several small, individually trivial interactions, which collectively are far from trivial. And this is a good example of that, because on every single street in this neighbourhood, there's an estate like this. Now, there's an old adage we all carry around with us, which in the past, people used to be more house proud. I don't believe that, actually. In the past, local authority run social housing had housing inspectors that regularly walked the streets and said to people, if your house is in a poor state of repair, or if you're not actually maintaining your property to the standards we expect, then we will do something about it. Actually, over the last 30, 40 years, we've lost the kind of landlord-tenant authority in many of these neighbourhoods, and this kind of behaviour is allowed to carry on, and it festers, and it obviously leads to a gradual deterioration in the sense of pride people have, and there's, you know, to classic broken windows theory, once one property becomes like this, then several others become like this. And it doesn't have to be that way. Actually, a stricter management regime can put a stop to this kind of thing. So what we've been doing is working with the owners of these estates to help fix these problems. Large communities and large housing environments, they need an active and curated programme of public realm management, okay? We can't just create parks 50 years ago and expect them to just remain that way for ad infinitum. They need regular reinvestment and regular curation. The open space that sits within these environments needs active management, whereas sadly, an awful lot of the asset management that's been done in social housing, it just focuses on the properties. It doesn't recognise the criticality of the space that sits between the properties, and things like litter start to accumulate, fly tipping happens, and so on and so on. So there needs to be a more aspirational approach to asset management and the standards of neighbourhood management as well. And as I said at the start, a critical part of what we think needs to be done is enhanced socioeconomic diversification. And we can do that through the introduction of new homes and actually through remodelling existing homes. And all of that is intended to rekindle a sense of pride and a sense of place in these neighbourhoods. And some of the things we're doing are turning streets that currently look like this into ones that look like this. So we're reinstating the hedgerows. We're actually using MMC, modern methods of construction, to overclad the properties and make them much more thermally efficient so that they can benefit from renewable heat. But actually reinstating a degree of character alongside that, and replacing things like outmoded verges with active leisure infrastructure and wildflower planting, animating the park, putting in place better, more appropriate play infrastructure for children. And actually, what's interesting about this area is the loop around it is exactly 2.5 kilometres wide. So we're installing a running track, which is designed to help encourage people to become slightly more active and more physically active. And this is interesting. These properties are currently 2-bedroom semi-detached houses, whereas the overwhelming demand for properties on this estate comes from single-parent households or single-occupier households. And so we're densifying these neighbourhoods by introducing remodelling to the properties to create 4 apartments where there were previously 2 semi-detached houses. And I know to some extent that will be seen quite controversially, but actually we're producing more affordable housing output to those people who need it the most, but we're doing it in a way as well where we're creating quite an aspirational product. If you were to see these houses today, you'd be quite surprised at the standards that they're able to let them at. Actually, our view is it'd be far better if these properties were taken into the marketplace for affordable tenants and offered to occupiers at a very, very high, almost aspirational standard, as you and I might expect to move into a new home. So things like ensuite bathrooms, which are largely unheard of, but actually are really, really helpful if you're a single parent living with a teenage child, trying to get them ready for school in the morning. Fighting over the shower is obviously one of those things that's going to hinder your ability to get ready and so on. So we're actually creating properties which have features and attributes within them, which are rarely seen actually, particularly in some of these estates in the north, for affordable housing occupiers. And all of that really is intended to provide the basic foundations and physical infrastructure for the community to, and it's a bit of a cliche, but for the community to flourish once again. Because actually, I mean, I personally grew up in one of these estates and it was a flourishing environment. But when I go back to the estate where I spent my childhood, it's got all the characteristics I explained at the start of the presentation. There's litter, there's a deterioration in the public realm, but it doesn't have to be that way. And our business model is about creating the physical environment and the infrastructure to lift these areas so that the community can once again start to enjoy them. And on the back of all of that, commercially, we're discovering development opportunities. At the end of the day, we are a commercial business. We need to make money. And on this neighbourhood, we found capacity for a further 120 new build homes that we'll be developing in the future. And there are other commercial drivers for us. There's 118 new properties that we can create through the remodelling. There's 18 new build homes that we're creating on infill sites, 120 new homes that I've described. And all of that, alongside the public infrastructure and the public realm, can be created with an investable IRR. So from our perspective, the local authority housing estates, they are forgotten assets, they are underutilised, and they provide a real opportunity for new housing output. Whereas for the public organisations, that's very efficient actually, because they already own this land, so they're not having to pay for the land for new affordable homes. It actually provides them with an opportunity to join things up more effectively than their current approaches tend to allow for. And it provides a really solid platform for much better asset management. In this organisation that we're working with, this large RP in the north, they were already planning to do things like render replacement on these houses, but they weren't planning to do that in a way which is joined up with. Actually, well, if we just take that render replacement on a level, we can deal with the thermal bridging in these houses and make them really airtight. And as a consequence of that airtightness, we can then install some renewable energy infrastructure, which means we can put the properties onto a trajectory towards a low carbon future. And actually doing these things around a place-led plan provides an opportunity for their existing investment to go an awful lot further. And it's a basis, I think, for running social housing assets and social housing estates long term, which I think is a foundation for many of these estates, of which there are 500 in the country, and as an untapped asset to produce much more housing output and create a transition towards a low carbon future. They're currently largely overlooked, but we're excited about what we're doing, and I look forward to hearing any of your questions. So Will, I'll just stop sharing there.
Well, thank you, David. That was incredibly interesting, and I know we've got a lot of interest from our audience and good numbers joining us this morning. So that's great to see. Please do send in your questions. Keep them short, but I'm very keen to put them to David. I'd just like to start off with a question about your background, David. I think you mentioned that you were brought up on a council estate, which is a really interesting parallel to what you're doing now in your career. Tell us more about that, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I was actually born in Johannesburg. My family emigrated in the early 70s, and I was born over there. And we had a good life. My dad had his own business over there. And, we lived in the sunshine and all those sorts of things. But actually, sadly, my mother's dad died quite suddenly, and it sort of reinforced this sense of distance between the family and our family back in England. And we decided to leave and come home. But actually, it was a point within the South African political history where migrants, which we were, if you were a recent migrant to the country and you decided not to stay long term, actually, as a disincentive for you to leave, your assets were frozen. So we had a family home over there. My dad had a small business. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we had an income, we had a decent lifestyle. But my mum decided, no, we're going home. I feel dreadfully homesick. And so we came home, and we were completely penniless as a family. But actually, within a couple of weeks, actually, we were in a new build council house. And I often think, what would happen to my family if we were faced with a similar situation? If we were faced with those circumstances, we'd have probably today ended up in a privately rented home with no doubt, because we had no money. It wouldn't be a great one. There's probably all sorts of problems with the home. The pressure that would put on your family network could be great. My parents could have ended up separating. I could have ended up in a kind of broken household and all this sort of stuff. So actually, my personal experience is having access to really good quality social housing, which we did, provided a fantastic foundation for the rest of our lives, actually. And I think, sadly, our situation was quite unique, but actually many families are experiencing similar sorts of issues, and their ability to access good quality, affordable housing is a major constraint on their ability to thrive. So that's been an important driver in my life, and it was a driver behind the establishment of the business that we recently sold, actually, a company called Place First, which delivered a lot of private rented homes, but aimed very much at a similar demographic, people who were sort of a step ahead of the ladder in terms of affordable housing, and were in between the gap between social housing and first-time buyer markets, but for whom actually the product out there was really, really poor. So we actually delivered about 1,000 properties, from refurbishing derelict old terraced homes, and the demand was overwhelming.
Were these some of the Pathfinder homes that?
No, they were. The biggest project we did was in Liverpool, which was quite a controversial Pathfinder scheme. Ringo Starr's birthplace was one of the properties that was earmarked for demolition. But the community was very divided about this project. One half of the community wanted to see them demolished, the other half wanted to see them retained. The underlying problem, actually, was prior to the local authority CPOing them all, they were poor quality private rental stock, exactly as I've described, with the whole host of social problems that went alongside, physical deterioration in the neighbourhood as well. So after several years of them standing empty, we ended up buying them from the local authority and remodeled them to create affordable private rent homes, which very much aimed at what we probably call key workers now. people on moderate incomes but providing essential services, quite a few self-employed people as well who would struggle to get a mainstream mortgage. And we converted the properties into what ultimately became, an award-winning estate, and people were very happy living there. What we're doing this time with this business is taking the experience we developed there and applying it, I think, to a bigger audience actually, and recognizing that a lot of the skills and capacity we developed over the course of running the last business are just as applicable to an affordable housing marketplace. And actually, you don't have to go very far before you find one of these estates, which actually they're not being well managed. They've got all the hallmarks of a great place. And what frustrates me hugely is actually all those attributes create good community.
But there is a real stigma, isn't there? As you said in your presentation, those more economically mobile people have tended to have moved out of council estates or former council estates, and a lot of them have become very stigmatized. They're run down, as you pointed out. So how do you actually tempt people to come back if you're adding to the homes in an existing former council estate place? How do you tempt those people to come back? Because surely that stigma is going to be a big barrier to that.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but obviously it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not a straightforward solution. But actually, I think first and foremost, you have to accept that we need to rekindle a sense of pride, and that actually has to come from the owners of the real estate. The local authorities have to be encouraged and show actually that it's their responsibility, or the registered providers, it's their responsibility to get these places to a standard where actually it's acceptable. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday which said if Highways England ran our road network in the same way a lot of registered providers manage their housing estates, we'd all have to drive around in tractors because the roads would be that bloody bad. You have to get the management regime absolutely right first and foremost, and then you have to start to adopt some very simple commercial principles, which is identifying the marketplace. The estate I've just given you an illustration of, it's a 5-minute walk from a local hospital. There are a huge number of key workers there who are probably renting houses privately or looking to purchase properties within walking distance of their workplace. There's capacity on this estate to service that market, but you've got to do it very well. The properties have to be great. The management regime that goes into the wider neighbourhood has to be great. And where you do have community assets, they need to be made contemporary and relevant to the needs of people today. So not skateboard parks where you're going to break your neck, but maybe a play facility where small kids can play and mums and dads can come together and meet one another.
And presumably you envisage architects having a role in all of this, and if so, how do you intend to employ architects?
That's a good question. We've worked with a great little team on this project who are based up in Manchester called Loop Systems. So they've been really great with us on this project. I mean, ultimately, our business, we intend to grow. And what we like is the idea of controlling our supply chain and integrating that supply chain into our corporate model. So I think Will, we've recently acquired a business in London called 4th Street, who are placemaking advisors. So they're the kind of front-end sort of concept and idea creators, which leads to design proposals. Our next acquisition is actually an architectural business. And we also want to acquire a business that's involved in communications and consultation and branding and so on. And those 3 pillars form the basis of the Place Capital business model that we then take out and we apply those skill sets to our own development projects or to the strategic partnerships we're creating with the registered providers we're working with. So, to answer your question, our next step on the design front is to acquire an architectural practice who share our values and vision, but also have the capacity to take on and deliver some of the projects that we're involved with.
And presumably it's too early for you to name names, but do you have any idea of, well, I mean, if you can name anyone you're interested in, but presumably you might be able to tell us a bit about what kind of firm you'd be seeking to acquire, you know, in terms of size, location, outlook?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously, yeah, we can't name names, but I think first and foremost for us is I have a very strong principle about design and development. I think far too many developers actually consider it's their responsibility to just totally outsource design and leave it to the design team. My own view is developers aren't particularly good if they can't design. You know, they need to understand their product. So the first quality for us in terms of a design business is an organization that's good at listening, you know, and really good at interpreting what it is we want. Obviously, we don't want people to be completely passive in that relationship. We want challenge, and we want people to show us things we've not thought of and examples of things from elsewhere. But that ability to collaborate and co-create with us is very, very critical, because I think it's critical that an organisation like ours is quite design literate and creative at its core. We're quite agnostic in terms of geography, you know. I don't know where you are today, Will, but, you know,
I'm in West London.
But the situation we've been through, we're all very close now, you know, without actually being physically close to one another. And that's a great thing, actually. We can do all sorts of things that we probably thought weren't possible little more than 18 months ago.
So these 500 estates, they're pretty evenly spread across the country, are they?
Yeah, I mean, our focus initially is in the north of England, and that sort of reflects where we are. We're based in Manchester, and we've got relationships up here. But no, our ambition is to work with as many of these estates as possible. So, you know, we need teams who are footloose, who are able to, and I think most people are these days. You know.
Yeah.
But
presumably, in terms of scale, you'd be looking at a fairly small architecture practice at this stage, would you?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking for an organisation that can grow with us. But also, you know, we've been in discussions with companies with about 20 practicing designers.
Yeah.
Some a little bit smaller than that, but somewhere in between that is the scale of organisation we want to integrate into the Place Capital Group structure.
Sure. Well, we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to now turn to the audience. This is a question from Sophie Camburn, who asks, in your model, how do you build in ongoing maintenance and the curation of the public realm?
Obviously, that's critical. It depends on what's being created, I suppose, but it's just funded through the rental collection and any service charge that would be levied on new build outright sale or shared ownership stock. You know, it's very important that it's the relatively straightforward part of what we're doing is sort of lifting these neighbourhoods to a better standard. The difficult part is maintaining that long term. So it's very, very critical that the infrastructure and the resource from either the rental flow or from the service charges on the assets that are being sold is sufficient to cover that. But there's a nice thing you can do alongside that, which is there's employment opportunities in that as well. You know, I feel strongly that most of these estates are big enough to justify their own on-site caretaking team. That could be employment opportunities or apprenticeship or training opportunities for the local community. Hedgerows all need to be maintained, grass needs to be maintained, and so on. And all
you've actually answered the next question in line from Victor Westerdahl, who's asking, do you have any strategies for bringing employment opportunities onto the estates you work on? So I guess you've answered some of that, but are there any other employment opportunities you envisage?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think as a developer, you know, we have to see where our boundary starts and stops, but we see it really important that we create a physical infrastructure to enable other service deliverers to come on and make sure that their services are performing as best they can. You know, in the example I gave you, it's wrong that a community building is accessible through an intercom system above a frozen food retailer. You know, that doesn't feel like an accessible community resource for me. So we're actually changing the dynamic of that in that particular instance. So that's very more visible. It's more permeable, so people can actually access it. And actually, the service deliverers are given an easier job to do. We're actually in the middle of hopefully securing something called community renewal funding on that estate as well, which is a short-term.
Just remind us where the estate is, if you would, David.
It's in Blackburn.
Blackburn, yeah.
Yeah, yes. I've been a little bit sort of coy about saying exactly where it is because there is a consultation and planning process that we're going through at the moment. So so we can't specifically name exactly what we're doing. Anybody who's got a forensic knowledge of these things may be able to identify it from some of the images.
Okay. Question now from Ian Stewart. Is mixed tenure a barrier where a pepper potting of sold-off houses is mixed throughout an estate, inhibiting overall improvement schemes?
It's a good question. That when we started to look at this place, the people who owned it were reluctant actually to do an awful lot with it because of this sense that there'd been an awful lot of right to buys. Actually, we decided to analyse that, and yes, there had been a number of right to buys, but there weren't an insufficient number to exercise control over the location. And actually, the proposals we've created include an estate-wide facelifting scheme, which includes those that are privately owned, because we want everybody, you know, homeowners as well as renters, to benefit from the proposals. And then on the back of that, we want to be introducing other tenures, including outright sale and potentially shared ownership products, in order that we can create some diversity in the neighbourhood. So it is a challenge. You know, that does vary on some estates where there's been huge numbers of right to buys, and it can be seen as a barrier, but actually it's not in itself a complete impediment to making these things work. And the thing, sorry, Will, but the thing we really like about these estates is, you know, they were built at a point in time where people's assumptions around things like cars and the need for garages were actually different. And there's an awful lot of infill development opportunities on these estates. I mean, the one we've just mentioned, you know, there's an awful lot of derelict garage sites that have sat vacant and redundant for a number of years. And actually, to repurpose those as new homes, be it affordable homes or outright sale homes, is eminently sensible because it's quite cost effective to do that. So
you'd be developing those new build parts of these rejuvenated estates, but would you also, as Place Capital Group, be renovating the existing properties, or is that the job of your partner, be it a housing association or an arm's length?
Well, yeah, the structure in that instance is it, you know, I mean, legally it's a slightly different contract structure, but in essence it's a partnership agreement. And we take the responsibility for the entire construction procurement, and we deliver the supply chain for the refurbishment, the remodelling of the stock that remains in the control and ownership of the housing association. But we take on the development risk and the development opportunity linked to the new build, where that is a tenure which is outside of the traditional affordable stock that the landlord in that instance wants to retain. But we're flexible about that. I mean, that can all vary in you know, with Place. You know, each estate will have its own idiosyncrasies and different development challenges, but our fundamental model is a partnership model, which is about saying, look, you own a lot of these assets. We've got the development expertise and capability to lift them and enhance them and materially improve the neighbourhood, whilst concurrently creating new build output, which creates development revenue, which can finance improvements and so on.
For sure.
I think that's the ingredient that's been lacking in estate regeneration over so many years. You know, it's largely been driven by the introduction of short-term grant funding to sort of prettify and change the estate, but it hasn't had the effect of long-term sustainable improvement.
It's too superficial, in other words.
Yeah. You need to really grab hold of these places and make them a contemporary version of what they were.
And meeting net zero standards is a huge challenge, isn't it, in terms of that sort of deep retrofitting that's going to be required. You did touch on that, but that's a big technical challenge as much as anything, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is. But I probably regret saying this. I personally don't think it's as big a challenge as necessarily people might have you believe. For one simple reason, actually, if you can combine an architectural intervention with an infrastructural intervention alongside an energy procurement strategy for the neighbourhood, then actually you stand a fighting chance of delivering that objective. And what I mean by that is we can take a block of properties, we can do a thermal refurbishment of those properties so that they can then benefit from solar with batteries, renewable heat through an air source heat pump, for example. And then actually, that property won't fall off the grid at that point. But what we can do, because of our control of the wider stock, is we can introduce smarter energy procurement from third-party generators who are generating from renewable sources. And I think those three components actually are quite a clever way of putting these neighbourhoods on a trajectory towards a lower carbon future. We've debated things like electric vehicles and everything else on this neighbourhood. That's certainly possible. Whether or not the timing for that is right today, given the kind of levels of wealth people have in these estates, we just have to be quite sensitive to putting all this infrastructure in, which might frustrate people because probably think, how on earth do you think I can afford an electric car?
Yeah.
But certainly dealing with the thermal envelope of the properties and the infrastructure alongside a smart procurement regime is a strategy which I think could be rolled out and scaled up successfully.
We've got an awful lot of questions, so I'm not going to get to all of them, but I'm going to ask another one now from Ben Tabiner, who asks, I'd be interested to know how you're managing community engagement, particularly given COVID restrictions.
Yeah, that's a good question. At the moment, I mean, the reason why I've not mentioned the estate is we've not actually initiated that process yet. I think very simply our expectation is, or our plan is, we don't want to simply put a microphone in front of the whole community and say, what do you think are the problems here? Because I think that's been done before and it very, very rarely works and it creates frustration and cynicism. What we want to do is we want to launch the engagement process alongside launching some of the development proposals that we've got. So our intention in this instance is to produce some show properties, which will then be presented to residents as, look, this is our aspiration, this is what we would like to do, but what do you think about that? And it creates a tangible platform for engagement as opposed to a kind of theoretical or design one. People can actually engage with something physically, then there's a basis there for a debate and a discussion, and there's a sense of confidence that can be created that this isn't just words, this is actual real stuff that we're doing with physical things that you can touch and feel and engage with. Again, I think that's a much more grown-up way of doing it than we've done traditionally in estate renewal programs, where consultants have been dropped onto the streets with clipboards and so on and asked people to name, what are the 10 worst things in this estate? It just doesn't work that. I think there's got to be a degree of grown-upness about this and a degree of leadership actually to demonstrate to people this is what we're doing here.
What do you think of central government's attitude to housing delivery and including existing estates like the ones you're talking about?
How long have you got? Well, the system, for as long as I've been a professional, the system's always been in crisis. Without waxing lyrical too much about this, there's too much reliance placed upon the demands of the PLC community, who are producing really poor quality, in the main, housing output. There's some great examples, but in the main,
this is the volume house builders.
Yeah, most volume house building is taking us backwards, not forwards. There's evidence now that a lot of new build housing communities are creating car dependency, are fueling things like loneliness, are fracturing community. They're not bringing people together. And I think it's absurd, actually. I don't think this is very difficult. None of what I've said here is an innovation of mine. This stuff was being written about by Ebenezer Howard, a long, long time ago. And the philanthropic industrial movement, which led to the creation of garden villages and cottage suburbs, the design principles are still very much there. And I think actually the thing government could do is just remind everybody of that. We've lost things like CABE, we've lost things like design review, we've lost things like the investment regional development agencies used to do in things like capacity building. I think if we could build design literacy into local government and into the controllers of these neighbourhoods, then we'd stand a fighting chance actually of improving them. We wouldn't end up with the regeneration proposals like the ones I've just given you, which are well intended but poorly executed because of that sort of design paucity that sits within the infrastructure of housing delivery now.
But there seems to be criticism coming from the very top of architects in this regard. We've just ran a story today, actually, on our website about comments made by Robert Jenrick, the community secretary, who says that architects are imposing their visions on communities or their dreams on local communities. So he was speaking at an event organised by the Roger Scruton Foundation, and he said, quote, "The built environment shouldn't be something that is imposed upon local communities. It shouldn't be something which is the dream of an architect or what is fashionable to a certain type of person. If we can ensure that this is the case, or a different way is the case, i.e. that local people are the ones in charge, will make a significant step forward." Do you agree with that, David?
No, I don't agree with that. Let me give you a quick example of something that happened in my recent career. We were delivering a housing project in one of the northern cities, and it was the first time we'd done a housing project in this city. It was about 140 units, so it was a big capital investment for us. We were a little bit nervous about this, and so we decided to appoint a market research consultant, and we gave them our product, which was characterised with the following features: very much open plan, light and airy houses. They had small rear gardens with low fence heights at the back, but a high degree of community open space for the community to come together, so shared gardens, and no drive parking. It was all on-street parking. So we gave that brief to the market research consultant, and off they went and consulted with the residents of this city and came back to us somewhat sheepishly said, "Not sure you're going to like this. Nobody wants open plan. Nobody wants low fence heights, for goodness sake. Everybody wants to be barricaded into their own garden. And community gardens, look, it's not the 1950s. At which point I was seething, because all our schemes had just won pretty much every single housing award going. And I found that a little bit frustrating. So I said to the lady, "Can I ask you a question? What do you like for breakfast?" She said, "Excuse me." I said, "What do you like for breakfast?" She said, "Well, I like a fry-up." "Okay, right. What did you have this morning?" She said, "Well, I had porridge." "Right." She said, "What are you going on about?" I said, "Look, there's a difference between what's good for you and what you like, okay? The problem in UK housing is very few of us actually have the benefit of knowing what's good for us, because most housing estates that we've grown up in have either lost the features that ultimately make them good, or are designed out in the interest of the large volume builders. Most new housing schemes that are created today have very little public open space, unless it's an attenuation sump.
But Jenrick seems to be saying that, architects are sort of patronising the public and telling them what's good for them. We know what good design is, you don't. That seems to be what he's saying.
I don't think most citizens actually know what good housing design is, I'm not professing to be the world's expert at it, but I've risked, a lot of time and effort and money in this marketplace, and we've developed some very happy customers over the years. And with these projects, I'd hope to do exactly the same sort of thing. It's wrong, really, to assume, I wouldn't go about designing a car, but I know exactly what a good one looks like, and I know what an efficient and environmentally friendly one looks like. I couldn't, show me a house that's available to the mainstream population, which has those features. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
As long as we have sort of opinion like that being espoused to us, then actually it just plays into the hands actually of the identikit McKenny were volume house builders who think it's fine to build a house that looks the same in Hull as it does in Warrington. They're all driven by their demands, not the needs of people. And I don't agree with the minister's opinions in relation to that. Good design, there has been a lot of examples of poor design in social housing, and there's been far too much experimentation with lower income groups over the years. And, places like Halifax are a very good example of that, which are littered with really badly designed high rises, which completely destroy your sense of space and sense of place in that location. but we can learn from that and we can apply that learning to our new build. But to suggest that actually we should put the whole design mandate, into the hands of communities, I think is quite folly.
I mean, they seem more comfortable, ministers, talking about beauty. They don't seem to talk so much about good design. They want to talk about beauty and, local vernacular and that kind of stuff. I mean, do you think that's useful? Are you comfortable with the language that ministers use, or do you think that we've retreated a bit from, using useful things like good design and you mentioned CABE, which obviously was abolished or abolished as a public body.
We have seen a degradation in design standards and, and a relaxation of thermal efficiency standards and so on, and environmental standards. And I think that's a shame. I'm not a proponent of a highly regulated system or a regime which says this is what we must have. But I do think the key to this is unlocking consumer demand and through illustration of what great product looks like, we should hopefully be able to drive better design output from within the industry. But sadly, at the moment, so much of the product that's available to people is perceived as what people want, but actually it's not. It's what the PLC builders want to produce. Which
the shareholders, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly.
These big companies.
I do think, though, I'm optimistic about this, though, Will. There's a whole sort of emergence of a kind of new way of doing business. More and more organisations are becoming more socially and environmentally responsible. The industry is slow to react. It always has been. But with leadership and with innovation and the sorts of stuff we're doing, we can start to slowly and subtly change this. And, who knows, our children in the future, they may be living in things and in a PLC built house, which is absolutely fantastic and with all the hallmarks of a great community. And I'd like to be positive we can ultimately get there.
And what's the role of Homes England in all of this?
In what we're doing specifically?
Yeah.
Well, that's very fledgling at the moment, but I do have a sense, though, that Homes England are going through a process of internal review. They've evolved from at the start of my career, there were English partnerships, the government's regeneration agency to Homes Communities Agency, now to Homes England, which was effectively a bank and a sponsor of finance to produce more housing output. I do think there's a process of introspection taking place there, which is more about quality, it's more about place, and it's more about better output. And ultimately, I think that'd be beneficial to all of us.
And potentially, do you think more of a focus on reuse? Because it seemed to outsiders, I think, that Homes England has been very much about new build. Whether that's on sort of greenfield or brownfield site, let's start something new in a satellite part of a town or something like that, not the kind of stuff you're talking about.
Not initially, no. And I can speak from a very practical example here. Or a housing association can produce a new build house with an affordable housing grant to enable it to work, and it can charge a reduced rent as a consequence of that. It can't repurpose a building, at least under the current affordable housing grant regime, and qualify for that grant. So there's still a kind of structural deficiency there, which says actually, if you think about the estate, I've just given you the example on, I think 79% of demand is from either single parent households or single households who need 1 or 2 bedroom units, whereas actually there's an overwhelming number of 3 bedroom properties. So the supply and the demand aren't aligned.
Yeah, hence the subdividing model. Correct. You talked about.
Yeah, but that process, according to Homes England's policies on grant regime, doesn't qualify for affordable housing grant. So that sort of illustrates where the thinking is in relation to that.
And you've got the VAT barrier as well.
Correct.
Refurbishment versus new build.
Correct. Yeah, and I don't think these things are intended to militate against doing remodelling. I think it's just the VAT issue is an unintended consequence of it not having been thought about properly. It's a big challenge with refurbishing properties, but I don't think HMRC are trying to stop that. I just think they've not actually thought through the nuance of how this thing one plays. But remodelling is obviously a much more efficient way of producing the output. It actually helps to deal with some of the wider carbon abatement and reduction challenges, which are there anyway, that need to be dealt with. Far better we think about doing that activity alongside a process of rethinking whether or not that property is configured to meet the demand of the market right now.
Yeah. We've probably got time just for one or two more audience questions. An anonymous question now. Would it not be better to employ local architects who are invested in the local community, perhaps to supplement your in-house architectural design team?
Yes, and we are doing that actually. For example, you know, to deliver the housing output efficiently and effectively, obviously it's quite a technical piece of that. So we need to be confident in the resources that are being deployed there, because there's quite a degree of construction risk and liability. But things like the wider public realm, you know, I'm a strong believer that the design process for those assets that are being created in the name of the community should be done through a participative design process. So we're actually using a participative design methodology as part of our consultation arrangements for things like the park. And that's not to sort of belittle small architects or local architects. It's actually to say we've got to deal with the practical point that we need to be very confident. You know, there's a £20 million construction program that needs to be delivered here. We need to be absolutely tuned into the technicalities of that, but alongside of all of that, there has to be some engagement and participation in the community assets and infrastructure, which we done locally.
Yeah. Dominic Papa asks, how can estates take advantage of their location, especially in city centres, to bring education, skills development and employment opportunities to their residents within their estates rather than purely housing provision?
It's about infrastructure. You know, it is about infrastructure. You know, a lot of the community infrastructure has been mothballed in these neighbourhoods because local authorities have stopped to invest in them, or don't have the financial capacity to invest in them. It needs leadership and innovation from the landowners, you know, particularly some of the larger RPs. And again, that is starting to happen. Organisations like Places for People, for example, are starting to deliver some really interesting things. You know, there's taken over leisure centres and other bits of local social infrastructure, because I think they acknowledge and recognise that they're an intrinsic part of creating good environments with sustainable tenancies. But it's fundamentally about creating the infrastructure to enable services to be delivered locally.
Yeah. Okay. A question now from Anna Macmillan. You explained that you converted 2-bed homes into 1-bed homes, and there are presumably affordable housing shortages in the area. Doesn't that mean that you empty properties or chunks of the estate for periods of time to refurbish them? If that's right, how do you address phasing, and how does it impact the values of the new spaces and new properties you're trying to create?
Yeah, it is a real practical logistical challenge. Clearly, that's at the forefront of our mind right now. I mean, what we're hoping to do is create some of the new build housing output as the first deliverable, so that we've got places that people can decamp to. And then it's a question of trying to align the logistics of people. You know, not everybody will want to move into one of these properties, so you know, people can remain where they are. But those people who do express demand in going into one of the new units, you know, or vacating their existing unit, there'll have to be a decanting logistical process. And we want to do that in a way which avoids that being quite dictatorial. You know, there are tools that can be used as home loss payments, and people can be forcibly moved on. We ideally want to avoid all of that, because clearly that's going to create a degree of animosity amongst the local residents. So the idea is we try and do that in a managed logistical way, but it's not without its challenges.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. I'm sorry I wasn't able to ask more questions because we've been flooded with them. And I think that's testament to what a fascinating talk it's been, David. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Bill.
So that concludes our AJ100 Club event for today. Thank you once again to our speaker, David, and to our sponsors and everyone who's tuned in. Our next AJ100 event takes place in August, and my colleague James Maloney will be sending out details for that in due course. Thanks again, and goodbye.
Cheers.